we're going to be recording the webinar so that we can put it up on our webpage later, and we will also be posting up a PDF of the Q&As and chat questions that we answer, and the ones that we might not be able to get to if we get a lot of really good questions. So ultimately, the plan again for today is that after a couple brief introductions, Andrew's going to present an overview of the Bass Action Plan, and then we're going to move into the discussion Q&A part, hopefully, which will be the majority of our time this evening. All right, I would say it's 7:03. People can trickle in. Again, we'll have this recording up on our webpage so people can catch up if they missed off the beginning part. I would like to welcome everyone. My name is Mike Bosheen. I'm supervising fisheries biologist over our warm water program. And I'm very excited for us to be presenting this draft Bass Action Plan, which has been in the works for a bit, with our ultimate goal to improve bass fishing. So joining me today, who will do the lion's share of the work, is Andrew Bade, and our Director of Fisheries, Peter Erstead. And I'd like to open the floor to our Deputy Commissioner, Mason Trumbull, to say a few words to kick off this session.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, folks. Really appreciate you taking time out of your weeknight to, at least it's raining here in Hartford, so it's not quite as nice of an evening as it has been over the last few days. But thank you for taking time to come here and provide some feedback on the Bass Action Plan. Before we get going, I'd like to say a quick thank you to Ed Mikowski, Andrew Bade, and Chris McDowell. You know, it truly is an immense amount of work to put together these plans. 50 plus pages of Bass Action information is a lot, and I know they're passionate about it and really excited about it, so thank you. I'd also like to thank Pete Erstad for your leadership for the fisheries team. Really appreciate your work and your leadership. You know, before we get going, there's really one thing I'd like to say. There's a lot here. There's 56 pages, and there's a lot of different action items, and quite frankly, there's more action items than we can accomplish. But what we're interested in doing is hearing from you to hear what your priorities are, so we can, prioritize some of these action items in the best way possible. The goal is not just to crank out a plan, put it on the shelf. The goal really is to tackle it and start, working on it. So for those of you who are here to provide some feedback, thank you. Please, share your concerns, share also what you'd like us to work on. There's a lot here. I mean, this is a really great opportunity for us to prioritize that. So thank you. And without any further ado, I'll turn it back over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks, Mason. And then toss it over to Pete if you have anything you'd like to add. If not, throw it over to Andrew and we'll get started.
I'd just like to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and Mason pretty much summed it up. We're looking for input. There's a variety of ways that can be accomplished, and I'll just kick it over to Andrew so we can get going and get into the meat of it.
All right, thanks for the introduction. I'm Andrew Bade. I'm a fish biologist with the Connecticut Fisheries Division, and I've been working with Ed Mahowski, Mike, and Chris McDowell and the Fisheries Division staff on this plan for a while now. And so what I hope to accomplish is a brief overview of the plan. If you want all of the specific action items and objectives that are in the full plan, I encourage you to read it. It's available on our website. If you Google Connecticut Bass Action Plan, it's the first result, at least for me. So this will be sort of a high-level overview. That way we have a lot of time to address some of the questions that we've been getting already, and then also to open the floor for hopefully a lot of questions and discussion tonight. So first off, just a brief background. I assume if you're here, you already care about bass and you already know a lot about bass, but bass are really important, not just to anglers, but also to our ecosystems, right? They're socially, ecologically, and economically important to Connecticut. And accordingly, there's been a lot of research and a lot of management activities since the 1950s trying to figure out the best ways to optimize these fisheries to meet angler desires. And the purpose of this plan is to take into account the research that's been done, the data that we've been collecting, the angler preferences of Connecticut anglers as we understand them, and chart a path forward. So why do we need a plan? The last time we came up with a bass management plan was in 2002. And since then, angler preferences and behaviors have changed. The bass fishery dynamics have changed, so the bass populations themselves. We have evidence that some of our historically effective regulations are no longer having the intended effects. And we think there's opportunity to grow the relationships between the Fisheries Division and the anglers of Connecticut for mutual benefit. So point one, the anglers have changed. One of the big changes is, this is Connecticut data. So just to briefly describe the graph you're looking at, the y-axis is voluntary release rate, which is to say what percentage of fish that were caught that could have legally been kept were released. And you can see back in the 1980s, it was about 60% voluntary release rate. The flip side of that is people keeping about 40% of the bass that they legally could keep. And then as you move forward in the time series towards more recent dates, so into the late 2000s, it's essentially zero harvest in most systems. So largemouth bass and smallmouth bass are largely catch and release fisheries at this point. Another change since the bass management plan was written is that bass tournaments are increasingly popular. So back in the 1980s, we would issue about 100 tournament permits for bass fishing, and that number has increased to anywhere from 700 to 800 in a typical year more recently. And like I said, the bass fishery dynamics have changed too. So overall, we're finding that largemouth bass are slightly more abundant than they have been historically, and that the size structure on a statewide basis is more or less stable. But those statewide numbers sort of obscure the huge amount of variation from water body to water body, where we're really seeing, all over the place. Some fisheries that show that stereotypical stunting, where you have really high abundance and low growth, but then also some that are the opposite, like Candlewood Lake could be an example, where they're not hyper abundant, but they're growing to really large sizes. Smallmouth bass, on the other hand, we're seeing them in fewer places and less of them in some of the places where we do see them. So there is some cause for concern that in lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams, smallmouth are disappearing from some of the places where they've historically occurred. On top of that, the fish seem to be getting harder to catch. So there's the question, are there more fish there, and are the size of the fish changing? But given that they're there, they can still have physiological or learned differences that make them harder or easier to catch. So one of the effects of catch and release fisheries is that a heavily fished location, the fish had been caught previously by the time they reach large sizes. And we know that bass learn lure avoidance. So you can have reductions in catchability. We also know that selective mortality caused by angling can have a selective effect on the genetics of the population. So some work from Jan Michael Hessenauer and others in Illinois and in Connecticut have found again and again that experimentally and in practice, these unfished populations tend to have higher catchability, not only because they're naive, but also because there's some underlying physiological differences caused by the most aggressive, most catchable bass being selectively caught out. And then on top of that, so that's direct mortality. Fishing during the spawning season might be compounding this issue because we're having selective nest failure during the spawning season, where the highest fitness, most aggressive, best nest guarders are also the ones most likely to be caught and have nest failure. And like I mentioned, some of our historical regulations that were effective when they were implemented no longer seem to be working. So some research done by Jan Michael Hessenauer in collaboration with Fisheries Division staff found that a lot of our length limit and creel limit practices are probably obsolete, and the harvest rates are too low for them to be impactful. And then lastly, like I mentioned, we think there's opportunities for us to engage in a more two-way relationship with bass anglers for a bunch of reasons. I think that would improve our management. For one, you guys who are fishing water bodies week after week, year after year, you can share that knowledge with us, and that helps us identify emerging threats, what you want out of the fisheries. Are our management activities actually working? and then also buy-in and awareness of what we're doing. And ultimately, to just help us figure out what it is that you want and are the management activities we're taking actually achieving that. Because we do have shared goals here. All of us just want bass fishing to get better. And so to develop this plan, we had some face-to-face public meetings. Ed Mahowski was in charge of this. He's recently retired. Those meetings were cut short due to COVID, but we followed up with an online survey that was sent to all freshwater licensed anglers who had valid emails in the online licensing system, and about 4,600 replied. And we evaluated those survey responses to gauge what anglers wanted, and we paired that with the research that we've done in Connecticut and that's been done nationally through a literature review to figure out how we can best achieve the aims that are set by the anglers. And so the action plan, based partly on other plans that our division has recently put out, is organized into themes. And this plan has 4 themes, and I'm going to describe them further coming up, but just to say what they are. The first is to enhance existing fisheries. The second is create new fishing opportunities. Third is monitor bass fisheries and habitat management. And fourth is public engagement. So the first theme is to enhance existing fisheries. The first part of that is understanding our baseline now and historically. And so we've been collecting a lot of data via a lot of mediums. So electrofishing, where we go out and sample populations by stunning the fish. We've also been doing angler surveys, less lately, but pretty intensively until 2017. Tournament anglers report their catch to us. And we've had a variety of surveys that have gone out to the public. And so we want to take full advantage of that information, and not only take advantage of it internally, but make sure that we set up mechanisms so that you guys can see that data also, and we'll have a more transparent, understanding and shared understanding of where we're at. Then, given that information, explore opportunities to enhance our fisheries, whether that's through regulations or stocking or other methodologies. And just to be clear, this is not a regulations proposal, this plan, and any regulations that are formally proposed would go through an additional comment period. The second theme is to create new fishing opportunities. So there's 2 parts to this one also. The first is to pursue access to previously closed drinking supply reservoirs. So have conversations with the regulatory agencies in the state and also the water companies themselves to see if we can't identify opportunities to increase access. Some of them are already open on permit basis, and we think there's an opportunity to push that further, go further in that direction. And then the second is to allow more fishing in our bass management lakes. So like I've been mentioning, our data are suggesting that a lot of the experimental regulations we've tried aren't very effective. They may be obsolete. And I think there's opportunities here to simplify our regulations and allow more tournament fishing during currently closed periods on bass management lakes, and maybe get rid of some of the lake-specific length and creel limit regulations. Then the third theme is to monitor bass fisheries and habitat management. So I just was talking about all the things that we've done historically to monitor our fisheries, and we want to continue doing that, but put more of an emphasis on some of our most important resources. So for example, Candlewood, we want to be able to get there annually, sort of have our finger on the pulse. Then also protect habitat. So that involves providing comment on herbicide applications, for example, providing comment on drawdown regimes that are being established to try to make sure that the interests of fish and fishermen are being considered in that process. Protect diversity, so protect the genetic integrity of bass in Connecticut. That refers to the stocking from other regions in the state or stocking of other subspecies of bass, so Florida bass, for example. And then enhancing habitat. This is largely thanks to Connecticut Bass Nation gifting us some side-skirted sonar units. We're planning, and they've sought out opportunities to put habitat structures into Housatonic River impoundments. And we want to see if those artificial habitat structures are helping, start evaluating habitat on a regular basis, and looking for opportunities to enhance habitat where appropriate moving forward. And then the last theme, public engagement. The idea is to increase the relevancy of bass and bass fishing to anglers, and also to people who don't necessarily fish or fish for bass. And particularly, we want to increase awareness and relevancy of our bass fisheries in underserved communities. And like I've been saying so far, we want to make sure that bass anglers are being heard, that you guys have an opportunity to influence management, to hear what we're doing, we can hear what you're doing, and hopefully accomplish more together. So make sure that bass anglers have a seat at the table as we pursue the actions in this plan. So I already mentioned this, but I want this to be really clear, is that this plan is not a formal regulations proposal. So justifying new restrictive regulations requires a really high bar of transparent evidence, and we're not there yet on many of the actions proposed in this plan. And so the first goal in the plan is to assess black bass recruitment, size structure, growth, other relevant characteristics like harvest through angler surveys, tournament data, to assess how our fisheries have changed through time and see if any of these potential regulatory actions are justified, and make that data, that work will be available publicly. The application or the regulations discussed in the plan will depend in part on those findings. And if we do move forward with proposing new regulations, there would be a public comment period for those regulations, separate from the conversation we're having now. So another thing that we talk about potentially doing in the plan is bass stocking. And so similarly to how restrictive regulations have a high bar of evidence, dedicating a lot of resources to a stocking program similarly needs substantial justification. And we've been reviewing the literature on bass stocking efforts previously in Connecticut as part of a program in the 2010s, also communicating with experts from other states who are stocking and thinking through what exactly that stocking program would look like. And so we are exploring it. We're taking the idea seriously, but there's a lot of legwork to be done. We're not going to be stocking bass tomorrow. Some other things to talk about. Like I said earlier, we want bass anglers to have a seat at the table. We want to be able to stay in touch with what your values are, what you want to accomplish. And we want to improve trust by being transparent in our decision making, right? So we want to make the data that we're using to inform our decisions available and have a clear point A to point B of how we're going from the information we have to the actions we propose. Along those lines, we want to support you guys in identifying grants and competing for grants to do the awesome work you guys are already doing. So things like habitat enhancement projects or river cleanups, youth fishing events, please let us know how we can help in those activities, and we're happy to do so where appropriate. And then the plan is a living document. So share your thoughts now. Share your thoughts with me later by email or call, on Facebook. However, we really are listening. You know, we're going to go through this public comment period and finalize the plan, but even after the plan's finalized, it's going to be a living document that'll be revisited and altered as we learn more and better understand our fisheries and the people who want to fish for them. So when we sent out the plan and on our webpage, there was a feedback form. And a lot of people replied to the feedback form. And before we open it up for questions, I'm just going to address a few of the questions that were frequently asked through that medium. So one is, why don't we stock Florida strain bass? It's a good question. People will reference things like the Share a Lunker program in Texas, which has been a really big success there. Unfortunately, Florida strain largemouth bass don't do very well in northern climates. They're used to having a larger growing season than you would get in Connecticut. And on top of that, the hybrid bass tend to have lower reproductive fitness. So you can end up with recruitment problems in fisheries where they're hybridizing with currently existing bass. So there is a climate band in the south to like the mid-Atlantic where it can be really productive, but we are too far north and there's a real risk where it actually damages the native fish populations insofar as they hybridize. So one thing we don't talk too much about in the plan are sort of bigger, broad scale habitat changes, things like eutrophication, which is just nutrient loading in our aquatic systems, climate change, et cetera. And those things are really important. So like I mentioned, we're seeing range reductions in smallmouth bass. That could very well be related to large scale habitat changes. You know, what habitats are meeting their thermal preferences, for example. The action plan tries to focus to the extent we can on the things that are under our control, which is why there's a relative lack of emphasis on sort of these large regional forcers, but that is certainly an important factor to consider. Another one that came up a lot is what effects we think other introduced species could be having. So like channel catfish, walleye, northern pike. That's a question that we haven't always maybe addressed to the extent that we could. You know, there's a historical model of single species management, but that is a work in progress now. It is something that we're thinking about, and we are in the middle of assessing a number of our stocking programs, especially walleye stocking, and we will report back. But I don't know the answer to that offhand, but it's an important question and one that we're looking into. So another one, I sort of already touched on this in the plan, but people are wondering what about more local habitat changes caused by things like herbicides, grass carp, drawdowns, et cetera. And certainly those can be impactful. So we know that drawdowns and herbicides, for example, do reduce some of the types of fish habitat that multiple life stages of sport fish and their forage rely on. But there's competing interests that we need to take into account. So there's property owners, there's other recreational uses, and we need to balance these. So hopefully, and what we mentioned in the plan is we'll focus on some of the really high quality bass fisheries or bass management lakes and see if we can't focus our efforts on protecting habitat there. How will regulations be enforced? So some concern about, for example, the terminal tackle regulations that are suggested or considered in the plan, if they're enforceable. Well, Deep Environmental Conservation Police, so ENCON, is going to have the opportunity to review any proposals that we submit to move forward with, suggest changes as needed. They're always going to be struggling to be everywhere all the time, but they are going to do their best. And then also, how would creel or length limit changes impact bass tournaments? I think that maybe we could have been clearer in the plan on this. And if, for example, we went forward with a 4-fish creel limit or slot limit on a statewide basis, tournament anglers would be able to get an exemption from those as part of the permit application process. So that should not alienate tournament anglers. Okay, and so like I mentioned, sort of a high level overview of the plan, and I'm happy to take your questions. If you're not comfortable bringing up your question in this context, I have my email here. It's andrew.bade@ct.gov. I also have my phone. You can call or text. Happy to get back to you. And like I mentioned, this was sort of a high level overview. If you want to go through all of our justification, all of the action items, I really encourage you to read the full plan. And thank you for your time. Happy to take any questions, Mike.
Yes, great. Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate that overview. Very well done. We've got questions in 3 different locations. We've got them in the Q&A section, the chat section, and hand raising. So I'm going to start with hand raising. I'm unmuting David Miller. You should be able to talk, David. Or not. Are you there, David? All right, so that doesn't seem to be working with the hand raising. So let's go to our Q&A. So let's vote, instead of raising hands, folks, for now, till we figure that out, I'll go to the Q&A and read them off. First one in there was from Michael Farrell. Can you see them as well, Andrew? So the question is, does the deep or bass tournaments currently have, or are you considering any initiative that might provide a mechanism for local communities where bass tournaments are held to benefit financially in any part from fees or taxes collected, levied for tournament costs or licensing, so that they may be supplementally supported financially to offset the costs of maintenance and healthier water initiatives for their communities? So at least on that end, Michael, we'll have to get back to you. We have not had, I'm not aware of any discussions we have had to that end, but you bring up a point that's worth our discussing, is how can local communities that are picking up the cost for maintaining certain water bodies maybe get, in a sense, reimbursed through some sort of user pay, user play, something or other like that. I guess that's the gist of that question.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add other than it's a free application to have a bass tournament through Deep. So if you're doing a tournament application, we're not charging. So exactly how, what fee or tax collected, I'm not sure, but I mean, it's not to put the idea down. It's a good idea. Yeah, like Mike said, it's not immediately obvious. We haven't talked about this.
All right. So again, for all the questions, if we get to them or if we can't get to them, we're going to go through these one by one. We're going to put them into a PDF and we're going to put it on our webpage, and then we'll email out to all the attendees who came to let them know that the questions and the answers that we came up with are there. But that'll give us a week or two to get that done so that we can follow up on some of these. So the next one, Andrew, is from Kevin Knoll. Fishing pressure, #1 threat. Has this been scientifically proven, or is this just perceived based on bass survey? And then following up on that, the same person, overfishing is a real concern. Are you defining overfishing as high concentration on angling on a water body? Since you said that bass fishing in Connecticut is typically catch and release, not harvesting bass.
Yeah, good question. So when we're saying in the plan that fishing pressure is the #1 threat, it's like you're suggesting. We're saying that anglers surveyed rated that as the #1 threat. Not that it is necessarily the #1 threat, scientifically speaking. So the context in which we brought that up was like you suggest. That was a response of the public to the question of what's the #1 threat to bass fishing. But that said, is overfishing a real concern? It can be. It's very different. I see how overfishing is a confusing term applied in other contexts like marine fisheries. It has a very specific meaning about what's the fishing pressure and what's the stock abundance relative to some target. It doesn't mean that necessarily in this context, and that is confusing for sure. Essentially, the question is the level of fishing effort dramatically reducing fishing quality? And in some cases, the answer to that is a straightforward yes. And you can see that experimentally in work, for example, by Jan Michael Hessenauer out of UConn in collaboration with Fisheries, did experimental angling on a number of hatchery ponds with different source populations of fish. And you can see that the fishing becomes, not catching very quickly after repeated catch events because the fish are learning. And so, again, it depends how exactly you define overfishing. If you define overfishing as fishing pressure that dramatically reduces the quality of fishing, then yes, I would argue that overfishing is a real concern for bass in Connecticut.
Great. Paul Ferrari says, would targeted dredging be a tool used in shallow eutrophic ponds to help improve bass habitat? That's part one. So I'll let you, if you, then second, would culling overpopulated fish species be another tool used to manage freshwater fisheries? It provides less competition for a finite food source and allows for better growth rates, which is true. And then third, considering opening lakes closed to fishing that are not privately owned drinking water supplies. Example, Brides Brook Lake in East Lyme. So if you want any feedback on that, Andrew?
So targeted dredging in shallow eutrophic ponds can and has been used to improve fish habitat. That is a tool that we use that comes up occasionally. Our habitat conservation enhancement staff would be better placed to give you specific examples of that. But when those opportunities arise, that is an activity we do. The second question, would culling overpopulated fish species be another tool used to manage freshwater fisheries? Yeah, potentially. Some of the historical regulations have been based on the idea that we could increase harvest of certain size class of fish in order to increase growth rates. At this point, voluntary release rates are so high that it's actually not straightforward for us to increase harvest, even if we want to, even if we think it's desirable for people to harvest bass, for example, we aren't always able to do that. And then the last part, open lakes closed to fishing that are not privately owned drinking water supplies. That sounds like a good suggestion. Honestly, I can't think of those examples or why they aren't open off the top of my head. So I can't really give you an informed response as to why we haven't done that. But so I'll definitely look into it. Thank you.
Great. Brian Lee asks, how are smallmouth populations measured? By fishing reports, example, catching a lot, etc., or by electroshocking? I know they can generally be elusive, even if there are plenty present.
Yes, good question. I'm referring to electrofishing. And smallmouth bass are not as catchable by electrofishing as largemouth bass are. And so they could be continuing to exist at low abundances and we're just not sampling them. And one of the items in this plan is to better understand the extent of their range reduction and abundance reduction. And we're probably going to have to use some alternate means to, give a second estimate to go along with the electrofishing. Things like angler surveys, tournament reports, et cetera, to see if other people are finding these fish and we're just missing them via electrofishing, which would still be important in and of itself. It would suggest probably there's a reduced abundance at the very least, but they could be present in low numbers and we're not detecting them. Those numbers, again, they are referring to our electrofishing efforts.
Great. Frank Polifrone says, great info, much appreciated. Question for catch and release tournaments. What is something we can implement immediately to help support this initiative?
Good question. I mean, if you're already running the catch and immediate release style tournaments, I don't know if I have much for you. It sounds like you're already doing a lot. If there are any projects that you wanted to do, any sort of cleanups or habitat enhancement or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me, andrew.bate@ct.gov, and I'd be happy to help, dig up some things that we could apply for and work on if that's something your club is interested in. But yeah, I'm open to your suggestions too. Thank you.
David Miller asks, what are the considerations for reintroducing natural forage opportunities to sport fishing Connecticut lakes, using an example of alewives? Yeah,
so that is something that we have talked about, and we're definitely open to the idea of. There's a number of reasons why it's sort of a complicated issue. One is for alewives, for example, there are some naturally landlocked populations, but most of the landlocked alewives are introduced and they can have some negative competitive interactions with native fish, for example. Then there are other native forage fishes where you have to wonder if they became extirpated from that location historically, have the conditions changed such that they could be reestablished now, or would it become like a regular stocking effort, in which case maybe the cost isn't worth it. But so there's a number of things to take into account there, right? So what's your cost benefit? What are the potential competitive interactions with existing fish species? But it is a potential management action that has been useful elsewhere that I'm definitely open to considering.
Great. Okay. And in my chat, David Miller says he didn't actually ask that question, which is interesting because it comes up in the Q&A section here. So sorry, unless there's two David Millers who are on our call, which there may be. So we're going to go on to Devin Ramos, who says, why does Connecticut still allow bass tournaments during the spawn? Almost every state around us are completely closed to catch and release only. Not only does it hurt our population, but it also hurts us as resident anglers, as there is much more fishing pressure during the spring than any other time of the year.
Yeah, so this is a question that comes up a lot. There's a lot of published research on this from around the country. Like you're saying, a lot of other states, including in the Northeast, have closed periods during the spawn, or at least catch and release fishing only during the spawn. And the evaluations that have been done on that policy have been very equivocal. So, for example, when those fishing regulations are removed, there actually used to be more closed seasons among states in the past than there are now. There wasn't much evidence that liberalizing the fishing during the spawning period had any negative effect. And conversely, places where they did evaluations after implementing closed seasons during the fishing season, they didn't always notice any benefit. And often you can actually have these counterintuitive issues that crop up. So, for example, let's say you disallow fishing during the spawning season and a ton of more fish are produced. So let's say fewer fish are caught off nests, therefore more nests succeed. Therefore, you have more juvenile fish. Well, potentially those juvenile fish are going to grow more slowly and reach smaller sizes because of the increased abundance. And so there's sort of trade-offs there that may or may not be desirable. That said, I'm open to it being helpful or not helpful. And one of the items in the plan is an experimental closed season on a number of lakes for a 5-year trial period to sort of answer the question here, because there's all sorts of complicating factors. What are the nest predators there? Is it a recruitment limited system or not? Et cetera, where you can't necessarily predict a priori what the effect is going to be on any given water body. So that's the reason why we don't have that as a statewide regulation, but also why we're including as an action item to run the experiment and see what happens if we close fishing on a number of locations during the spawning period.
Great. Next one up is Willard Platt, who asks, if bass management lakes are open to tournaments in the summer, how do you tell recreational boaters they have to go away when they already reach capacity at 10 in the morning?
Well, as I understand it, the person who is determining the size of tournaments allowed, so which tournament permits are getting approved, is going off of 50% of parking capacity is what's being allowed. I would argue that tournament fishing is just as legitimate recreational activity as any other. And so it's not obvious, how to balance those competing user groups. Yeah, I don't know if I have really a great answer beyond that. Do you have any thoughts, Mike?
Yeah, it's trying to manage a type of resource that is popular for multiple uses, and not all multiple uses can coexist as well. But that is true that for state-owned boat ramps, there is a 50% rule for any organized tournament. They're not allowed to have more than 50% capacity at the ramp, leaving the rest of the 50% for anyone who just shows up that would like to canoe, kayak, paddleboard, water ski, or even someone who wants to bass fish that's not part of that tournament. So yes, we do try. There is a 50% maximum capacity at any state ramp, but we're always open to seeing where that is working or not working. All right, let's see. Where did I leave off here? Ray Rondo, and I apologize that you raised your hand because I haven't been getting over there and it didn't seem to work at first. So he says, my name is Ray Rondo, president of Hogmaster since '87. My question is more of a comment. I would state that implementing catch and release requirements in a tournament setting would be very difficult to ensure fair competition without having a judge in a boat to verify weigh-ins. My suggestion would be to lower the bass limits per angler/team or invoke a midpoint weigh-in to allow fish to be released at the middle and end of a tournament. I implemented these strategies years ago with success at eliminating bass mortality. So awesome. Thank you, Ray, on that. And Andrew, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, those sounds like very reasonable ways to mitigate the harm you're doing. So thank you.
Jason Swanatek, hopefully I got that right. Have you considered a system where tournament anglers like myself and others would not live well bass or harvest bass during the spawning season, but could release immediately?
I'm sorry, could you please say that again?
Yeah, basically the question is have you considered having catch and immediate release tournaments during the spawning season?
Yes. So the experimental closed season I mentioned, we wouldn't be closing the water bodies and it wouldn't be technically illegal to target bass. It would just be a possession limit of 0. So if you wanted to have a tournament that was catch and immediate release, that would be fine.
Similar comment, David Miller. Hopefully this is the right David Miller. Closing bass fishing during the spawn would detrimentally affect tournament fishing by closing off the staple months of our season. Closing bed, capital BED fishing specifically, would be a much better option.
Yeah, it's really an enforcement question of how do you're sort of at that point having to police the intent of the person, whether they're targeting beds or not, or potentially creating sanctuaries where spawning habitat is. There's a lot of research on doing that. And you have sort of unintended consequences there where people will not follow the regulations if you create some sort of sanctuary. And it can actually increase fishing pressure if enforcement's not adequate, because people get the idea like, oh, this is this protected area, the fishing must be really good, and congregate there sometimes. But yeah, so it's a very reasonable idea. The only concern I have is the enforcement, but noted. It's thank you.
Great. And Ed Kadazweski. I'm hearing a lot of focus on tournament angling. I have not read the plan, but I hope the interest of fishermen who enjoy a fish dinner from their catch won't be overlooked.
Absolutely. Absolutely will not be overlooked. We definitely, it's the typical bass angler isn't quite as organized as the tournaments are. Just by definition, the tournament clubs have organizations. And so they are very proactive about reaching out to us and being in contact with us, and that's great. But we're absolutely doing our best to be tuned in to the interests of the typical angler who still makes up the vast majority of bass fishing in Connecticut. So thank you.
And this is David Miller again, and I think this is the right one, referring to spraying maybe. Yes, have the fish kills, loss of habitat, and delayed mortality caused by chemical spraying for weeds been recognized while developing this plan? Using Lilinona and Zora as an example, the population of bass has significantly declined as sprayings have increased in comparison to candlewood, which has not been sprayed.
Yes, that has been considered in the creation of the plan and is being considered moving forward. One of the projects that I've recently started working on in collaboration with our habitat conservation and enhancement staff is pulling out a database of where herbicide treatments have been done historically and keeping up with applications moving forward and trying to tie that data up to angler catch information and electrofishing information where it's available to see what sort of impact it's having, and then let our fisheries comments on those applications reflect the impacts that they're having on our fisheries. Because I agree, there are definitely situations where they are harmful to fisheries, and there may be opportunities for us to mitigate that.
Great. I'm going to jump over to the chat now that I had been in the question and answer piece. So thank you everybody for being patient while we go through these systematically one at a time. So this and let's see if I can expand this so I can see people's names. There we go. Joe Ventucci. Is there any chance of having immediate catch and release or closed season period? Many northern New York fisheries have this, and some are rated top 5 bass waters in Northeast, not just a top 25. A few years ago, there were no limits on saltwater fish, and guess what? Many became scarce. Don't think this can't happen in Candlewood Lake, or it can happen if it can happen in the sounds and canyons. A bedding bass removed from the bed puts in jeopardy repopulation. Why not try this for a couple seasons? Who knows? Candlewood may become a top 3 or maybe number 1. Why settle for less? You can still just fish, just immediately release during the bedding. Pulling a bass from a bed is pretty easy to do. It's defending its bed and fry. Let's let the fishery grow for the better of guides, anglers, and tourism. I realize bags are getting better, but that doesn't mean the population is growing. We don't know what happens once they're released as far as mortality during the beds.
Yes. So like I mentioned, it's a genuinely complicated problem. The research on whether or not fishing should be closed or catch an immediate release during the spawning period is not conclusive. But that said, we want to see if it works in Connecticut. And so one of our proposed actions is closing fishing or making it catch an immediate release only, I should say, during the spawning season on a number of Connecticut lakes and seeing what happens. Okay. So definitely open to that idea.
And up to Dean Rustick now in the comments, reading through the Bass Action Plan from 2002 and looking at this new Bass Action Plan, there are many of the same management tools, mostly regulations on the angler. From the data that was included, it appears that regulations at the bass management lakes have not had any sizable change in the bass. What will be different with these new plans that will make a difference?
Yeah, great question. So for one of the items that I think I'd like us to see move forward with is make those regulations less restrictive on bass management lakes. So like you said, and we agree, they don't seem to be having a positive impact and they're restricting people's fishing opportunities. And so we should probably simplify and not have them. In terms of why would the new proposed regulations be helpful, some of them are of a different nature. So for example, the experimental closed season or catch and release only season is sort of a different nature than a creel limit or a length limit, and that it could theoretically influence recruitment as opposed to just fishing mortality. Some of the terminal tackle things that are considered are also of a different kind. Then for the length limit and creel limit ones specifically, it's a valid point. They may have no effect. As I mentioned, we want to go through the angler harvest data and electrofishing data and say, okay, based on the population we're observing, we think that we could improve the fishery if we were able to reduce fishing mortality by this amount. And okay, so what does the angler harvest data look like? What creel limit and or length limits would create the harvest reduction that should result in that improvement? So that's sort of the difference. There are a couple of different types of regulations proposed now than were proposed previously. There's a more transparent process that I'm hopeful will sort of set us up for success, and it could just not be helpful. So, I mean, there's 100% chance, there's absolutely a chance that length limit or creel limit would not impact the fishery.
And all these things that Andrew mentions are the challenges that come with trying to manage a fishery that is based off of self-sustaining recruitment. So yeah, it's a challenge. Okay, Andrew Galicia says, hey guys, 2 questions. One, is the tournament data Andrew mentioned on the bass management water bodies publicly available? And I would be curious to see those numbers. And 2, is there any data on the catch and release mortality rates from tournaments? I would imagine that it is higher from increased handling and length of time between caught and released. However, I'm curious as to what the data is.
Yeah, good questions. So the tournament data, they're semi-accessible. You can go onto our easy file system and look at where tournaments are going to be. So you can look at the approved tournaments, but the summary data that I just shared is not publicly available currently, but it should be. And so that is added to my list. So the electrofishing data we collect, some summary of that should be publicly available, some summary of all of the reports that we're getting. So angler surveys and tournament reports, some summary thereof at least should be available. It's not now. I will work to make sure that it is moving forward. The second question was about catch and release mortality at tournaments. There's been a ton of research on that. It's actually relatively low. As far as the data suggests, catch and release mortality from tournaments tends to be around 2%. It can be much higher in certain specific conditions. So if the water temperature is really warm and largemouth bass virus is present, it can be much higher. But generally speaking, it's around 2%. And just to put that in perspective, the regular recreational angling, so non-tournament angling, tends to have a somewhat higher catch and release mortality, like around 6%, some studies indicate, but it's a little bit more variable.
Okay, I'm gonna Joe Benatucci again. Many reports are contrary to what you just said, and this was at 741. So about closing down during the bed season. Many northern lakes have improved since they closed or did immediate release. So I think that's more of a statement to some of our things that we've been going on versus a question.
Sure. Well, I'll respond to it though.
Sure.
Because it's like I'm saying, it's a complicated issue. Absolutely, some lakes have benefited, and absolutely some lakes have not. And that's why I'm open to running the experiment here, because I don't think that the available data can tell us definitively what result we're going to get.
Excellent. Gene Gilliland, sorry. Why should tournament anglers be hit with extra rules? Could tournament mortality actually be beneficial in helping balancing overabundant, slow-growing populations? That is, would it make up for the lack of angler harvest that used to happen?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I don't think that I am proposing tournaments specifically face new rules in the plan, just to address that comment. But that said, yeah, potentially there's trade-offs, right? So that could be beneficial. On the flip side, bass tournament guys are really good at catching fish, and increased catch events can lead to reduced catchability as they learn lure avoidance. But yeah. Okay,
David Miller in the chat. As far as closed seasons in northern states, the closed season runs through June. However, Connecticut is much further south. Therefore, our fishing season begins a bit sooner than northern states. Having a closed bass season for tournament anglers through the same time period would be a struggle to accommodate the current number of tournaments held annually. What is the current proposal for bass fishing season?
Yeah,
also,
go ahead.
Sorry. Also, what bodies of water would be affected? Tidal water such as the Connecticut River too?
Yeah, good questions. We haven't gotten that far yet to tell you exactly which water bodies or the exact time period. Like you're saying, protecting the spawning period would be the goal. And so we'd want the time period to be informed by when bass are spawning locally. So that would be the main driver. The secondary consideration would be wanting regulatory simplicity with neighboring states. So those would be the two factors driving it. In terms of which water bodies we'd want to select, we would want to select a gradient of water bodies with different amounts of fishing pressure. So some heavily fished lakes, hopefully some less heavily fished lakes, to help us understand what might be driving any changes that we see in population dynamics following the regulatory change.
Okay, and here's one that's definitely in our plan and a great idea from Dean Rustick, I feel. Would the Deep be open to have a bass review board made up of bass anglers, tournament and non-tournament, to work to review the gathered data and provide input of new ideas?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a pretty easy answer to that. On to the next one. The other David Miller is Matt Marinelli. Welcome, Matt. Mason says, thanks to all for providing such great comments and glad to see engagement on the plan. Brian Lee, as a follow-up to my question on smallmouth bass, some phenomenal smallmouth lakes have very limited access. For example, the state record was caught at Shinipsit, but access is frustratingly difficult. Could opening fishing access to smallmouth lakes like Shinipsit or Saugatuck help provide us more data on brown bass? I'd be happy to test that theory.
Yeah, I mean, if maybe we get more data. I don't know exactly how to answer that question.
Well, I
yeah,
think that's part of our looking into increasing fishing opportunities.
Yeah, it's part of looking into increasing fishing opportunities. It's also part of trying to understand exactly what's driving the declines in smallmouth bass. And so if it's fishing pressure, then I don't know if I like the proposal, but
correct.
But yeah, that's one of the things we're hoping to figure out moving forward.
Okay, Brian Konakowski, hopefully I get that right or close. Is Connecticut looking into raising bass, both largemouth and smallmouth? How about crappie also, as they are also a bass family?
So I don't think we've talked about raising crappie. As far as largemouth or smallmouth, it's not obvious exactly what the stocking program would look like. We're not there yet. One of the ideas that's sort of at the top of the heap is using some of the drinking water supply company reservoirs that are closed to fishing as sort of, you can almost think of them as grow out facilities, where we've done this in the past, where we go out and collect a number of fish and then stock them out into other water bodies directly, as opposed to growing them in-house. So our stocking program may or may not have a hatchery component at all.
Yes, and next comment, David Miller. Would selectively culling common non-targeted predatory species such as pickerel be a consideration to improve bass fishing overall? Sorry, let me say that again. Would selectively culling common non-targeted predatory species such as pickerel be a consideration to improve bass fishing and overall fishing in a lake?
I mean, potentially. So there's a few things to be said there. One is there are a number of anglers who target pickerel, according to our survey data on warm water fisheries anglers, especially through the ice. They're a native predator. They have their place. I don't know that I necessarily like the idea of calling them in order to improve bass fishing. So that's sort of like more ethical take on it, which is not to say that it just means I'm, trying to think through it ethically, thinking through it practically. So whether or not it would work, it might. I don't know that we fully understand predator interactions in Connecticut lakes and ponds. And that's one of the things we hope to understand better, that I brought up in the frequently asked questions, is how are these different introduced or non-introduced predatory fisheries interacting with largemouth bass. So it definitely has potential to work. It's a good suggestion, but I don't think I understand the species interactions well enough right now to give you any sort of definitive answer to that.
Okay, and Matt Marinelli says, what is the basis of quantifying fishing mortality?
Sure, so it's a little bit context dependent, what information we have available. One way that it's been assessed historically in Connecticut is you estimate the population size using mark recapture, and then you estimate the fishing mortality, so the harvest, using angler surveys. So we go out at random times, intercept anglers, ask them what they've caught, what they've kept, how long they've been fishing, etc. And then we use that to estimate how many fish were caught and harvested over the course of the season. And then we can compare the number and sizes of fish that were harvested with our estimated population size to come up with an estimate of fishing mortality. For example, sometimes it's not always that data rich, and we're using relative indicators of population as opposed to absolute population estimates. or we're inferring mortality from reductions from one age class to the next. So how many 4-year-old fish are we seeing? Then how many 5-year-old fish are we seeing? And then we just know what the mortality is, but not necessarily how much of it is fishing versus natural. So, exactly how we answer that question depends on the data available in the specific system.
Okay, and Craig Durland says, lack of access in many waters is forcing more pressure on a smaller number of bodies of water. State needs to work on expanding access with public. Oh, someone just put a new chat and it bumped me out of there. State needs to work on expanding access with public ramps and requiring water reservoir owners to accommodate anglers.
Yeah, we're trying to create new fishing opportunities. That's definitely a big element in the plan, and I pretty much agree.
Okay, George Escobert. I'm wondering how much of the fishing pressure on our lakes are from non-Connecticut based bass clubs. Have there been any discussions about restricting tournaments to only Connecticut based clubs to reduce the number of tournaments on lakes like Candlewood in order to reduce the pressure?
That has been suggested. I don't know that we've really talked much about it internally, though. And there's definitely trade-offs, pros and cons to that approach. I don't know that I really have an answer to that question right now. Do you have any thoughts, Mike?
That's probably a very complicated question when we start limiting access to that's through public funds and federal funds to any member of the public. It probably gets pretty legally challenging. So there needs to be lots of conversations there. Paul Ferry. It's not just reservoirs. All of these lake associations control many bodies of potential great fishing. Columbia Lake, Amston Lake, Manitouk Lake, etc. Sounds like, again, statement about expanding potential fishing opportunities. But when the property is held by private citizens, then it's even more challenging probably. We can't just walk in there and say, you have to let everybody come in here and fish if they own the property.
Yeah, but maybe there are opportunities to pursue easements but
yes,
yeah,
exactly. And thank you, Paul, for saying ferry is just like ferry. Got it. It's about 8:05. I think I've gone through all the questions in the chat or the Q&A.
I think you might have missed one.
Okay.
Maybe I'm wrong. Did we answer this one? It was, I have a huge concern with Candlewood Lake and many other lakes, but more importantly, Candlewood Lake. I own Bounty Hunters Custom Bait and Tackle in Newtown and Candlewood Lake Guide Service. Do we answer that?
No.
I don't think so. He says the Candlewood has no weeds this year for the first time in my life. That worries me as I have seen lakes go from a great fishery to stunted bass due to removal of all weeds from grass carp. On Candlewood, we have the winter drawdown. That should be more than enough for homeowners that do not want an essential part of the environment. We could be in a world of hurt on Candlewood if the weeds that provide exceptional habitat, nutrient soak, and much more do not come back. Squance Pond, Lake Wabeeka, Ball Pond, and many other lakes have suffered dramatically due to the introduction of grass carp. How can we manage the weeds better than overstocking carp? I am not an advocate for spraying. Yeah, so I have been hearing that a lot from a lot of anglers relating to Candlewood Lake specifically. And we went out sampling in early June. I also saw very little aquatic vegetation. Been hearing it from a lot of people who are there all the time. So I assume they're onto something, whether that's related to the grass carp or herbicide treatments. I don't think it could be herbicide treatments in Candlewood, but yeah, we're concerned about it. There's definitely a legitimate concern there. We are starting some research in collaboration with Western Connecticut State University to better understand what the grass carp in there are doing, what impacts they might be having. And we will absolutely be trying to learn from the experience that we've had with putting grass carp in there. because you're not alone. We hear your concerns. I share your concerns.
And while we're on that, popped up in the chat, Brian Lee said, comment, I am noticing a lack of weeds on a lot of my lakes in Tolland County. I don't know if it has to do with the quick warming pattern we had or herbicide use.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. It'll depend on the water body. So if you had a specific water body in mind and you want to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to track down and see if there were any herbicide applications at that water body to help answer that question. But offhand, I don't know the answer.
All right, and then I'm going to go to Ray Rondeau. Lots of good conversation. However, for clarification, would the plan be to alter tournament rules/requirements, or would bass clubs be exempt?
So it depends on the potential regulation we're discussing. If we're talking about the creel limits and length limits, then they would be exempt, and exemption would be built into the tournament application process. For the experimental catch and release only season, that would impact weigh-in based tournaments on the lakes or ponds where that's in effect.
Gene Gilliland says, most of the discussion has been about bass management. What about the public outreach goal? What does that look like? Coordination within DEEP and other agencies and NGOs promote the value of bass and bass fishing, including tournament angling.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely, including tournament angling. Dean has been great about reaching out to us, and we want to work with other clubs too. You guys are doing a lot of great on the ground stuff that we want to support. And so that's part of it, is we want to make sure we understand what you guys are doing and support you in the ways that we can, whether that's helping identify and compete for grants, publicizing the work you're already doing on our social media accounts where that's appropriate. And then other ways that we want to enhance public outreach, like we've been talking about, is data availability. So you guys have to work through us to get your tournament permits approved. You should be able to see some summary information about how many tournaments were out per year, how many tournament anglers were out, what did the fish catches look like on average. I think it makes sense for you guys to have access to that information. So that's another part of it. And then another part of it is just having ongoing conversations about what it is that bass fishermen are interested in, whether or not the management actions we're taking are actually conducive to what those interests are. One of the vehicles we've discussed for that is something like creating a state of bass meeting, for example, where each year we talk about the information that's been collected and then have room for discussion for people to bring up, what they would like to see us do differently, what they think is working, any emerging threats they're observing in their fisheries, et cetera. So I think it looks there's a lot to be said about it. And maybe we could be more concrete about those actions in the plan if that's not clear. Thank you.
Yeah, and another angle on that too is that if this was the angle you were taking, Gene, is that we have an angler recruitment, retention, reactivation plan and policy where we're working to bring, that has a big public outreach component in that, to bring new people who are interested in fishing but aren't really fishing now into the mix in general and get them to be fishing. And tournament bass fishing is definitely one avenue to get people to stay hooked and move forward. And we have those types of actions working with groups in that angler recruitment, retention, reactivation plan as well. Okay, Matt Martinelli, what impact does the age of a natural lake or upland reservoir have on the carrying capacity of a lake, and in turn specifically the bass population?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. At first, the age is going to be increasing productivity, generally speaking. As more sediment fills in, you're going to get more areas where light's reaching the bottom. You can have more primary productivity. Then obviously there's a logical endpoint where it's super shallow marsh habitat that's not always very conducive to bass. So, there's sort of a gradient where you have really deep or really oligotrophic water that's not super high productivity, not always great for bass. And then there's sort of a Goldilocks zone, and then it, reaches the logical conclusion of natural lakes and ponds, and it fills in with sediment.
Okay, I'm going to come back to David Miller again, or Matt again, but go to Devin Ramos first. Is there any update on zebra mussels being found in Candlewood?
Yeah, my understanding is that they're spreading in the lake. Do you have any more to say about that, Mike?
Yes, I believe that there is the Candlewood Lake Authority and others are working on making a more formal announcement that should be forthcoming any day now in terms of more being more aware of decontamination when being in Candlewood Lake and then moving out. But they're definitely in Candlewood Lake. All right, going back to the Matt Marinelli comment, how does the stocking of thousands of northern pike benefit the growth and forage for bass in a specific body of water? Example, Mansfield Reservoir.
It probably doesn't. I'm sure there's some trade-offs there where there's going to be overlap in the forage that they're interested in, and it could have negative impacts on bass.
And then another statement, instead of potentially shutting off fishing from certain areas to see if it increases bass populations, why not just open a closed body of water with a good bass population to anglers to see if it reduces the population? Have Deep work the gate and take a survey for those who choose to fish there instead of shutting off access to open bodies of water. Why are we expecting the taxpayers to be the guinea pigs for an unknown experiment?
Well, hopefully we can do the experiment you suggested if we succeed in opening new water bodies to fishing that are previously closed. So I would love to be able to do that. And then as far as being the guinea pigs, well, there's a lot, the public doesn't have a homogeneous opinion on this. We are hearing all the time from people who are really adamant that we close the spawning season. And then there's a minority of people who want the spawning season to stay open. We don't want to restrict fishing opportunities any more than is justified, which is why we want to run the experiment on a select set of water bodies as opposed to as a statewide regulation to hopefully alienate the fewest people possible while we figure it out.
Okay, and Daniel Stevens says it's a bit late to the party and apologizes, but he has some questions he'd like to ask. Daniel, we're having problems with opening up the mic for folks, so if you could just put them into the chat quickly, we'll get to them. Craig Duran says, in New Jersey, we are discovering that some lakes are receiving stockings from state programs, yet the lakes have no public access. Interest in a bill for access is growing. Do you have similar situations in Connecticut?
No, I don't think that we do.
No, because we're not stocking bass anywhere. So, but analogously, where we stock any sport fish, whether it be catfish, walleye, pike, or trout, we do not stock any waters that does not have public access to it. Devin Ramos, with the increasing amount of fishermen and fishing pressure, has Deep considered adding more game wardens to their fleet, as I've only been stopped 3 times in my entire life. I know Connecticut is a small state, but I do feel as we are lacking with actual feet on the ground, which in turn could improve fishing in general.
Yeah, I mean, do you have anything to say to that, Mike?
I do know that the law enforcement agency, like many other parts of our agency, the division, like many other parts of our agency, is suffering from lower numbers than would be optimal. Everybody's working to get back and build those numbers up. Again, it's always a complicated program when you're working with state funds and trying to balance an overall state budget. So yes, it's enforcement is something that is always the number one issue that comes up with a lot of fisheries, regardless of what it is, whether it's bass, trout, striped bass, bluefish, whatever. We would always hope that, as avid anglers, we all do what's right for the resource and what's right for the fish, and not try to get away with things just because there's less law enforcement out there, but we all know that that's not the case for everybody. And sometimes if people feel they can get away with things, they push the limits. But my advice would be to everyone, and I always say this on our Facebook page or whatever, if you observe illegal fishing anywhere, please call our law enforcement dispatch 860-424-3333 at any time, because if they don't know, they can't go. So they need to know where the issues are so that they can prioritize and respond. If we just lay quiet, then it's not that the issues aren't there, but they're not being prioritized. I hope that helps make sense.
Thanks, Mike.
Let's see. Dean Rustick just said that the NCON's down by about 30 officers. And how do I make sure that, all right, so that's Dean was the last message in the chat right there. And I don't have any new questions. Oh, Paul Ferry says, thank you, Connecticut Deep Fisheries. You do great work and with limited resources. Well, again, the whole purpose of this plan is a shared vision to improve bass fishing in Connecticut. One of the things that Dean Rustick first came to me when I transferred from the Water Bureau over to the Fisheries Division back in 2012, he came into my cubicle and he sat down and he says, what are you guys gonna do to make bass fishing better in Connecticut? And there's a lot of challenges there over the years. There's not a lot of simple answers, again, because it's a species that is not reliant upon stocking to exist. There's a lot of beautiful bass out there that have grown by themselves without anybody influencing it or putting them there. And to try to manage the environment and with lots of complicated factors, herbicides, climate change, that you can throw all the variables in there. We all have to work together to try to tackle and try to improve that. Hold on, I got some new chats here. Dan Stevens, I did not see any questions come up yet, but I see my questions.
I can see him in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. That one I didn't scroll down. I'm sorry.
Yep. So he asked, does anyone have a plan for the strain of hydrilla that is plaguing the Connecticut River? I don't know that I know the answer to that. Mike, maybe you are better positioned to answer that.
Probably not, but maybe Pete might. I know there's a lot of work and concern about hydrilla. Pete, do you have any updates for that?
Yeah, this is again a very complicated issue. There's a lot of interest in it. As most folks know, hydrilla can be a really nasty invasive plant. Actually managing it or controlling it in the Connecticut River won't be easy because of all the back codes and whatnot. And there aren't many ways to effectively treat it that work. There are chemical treatments that could possibly be utilized. Nobody has a specific plan now. I know there's some interest in large part by the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. They've been doing a lot of research and some experimental control work over the years in different water bodies. And I guess maybe more relevant is the fact that during this last legislative session, the Connecticut General Assembly established an Office of Aquatic Invasive Species, which will be housed at the Ag Experiment Station. So they're trying to gear up. I know they're looking for federal money. And like a lot of our conversations earlier tonight, we are well aware of the fact that, plants obviously provide a lot of great habitat, and there's always a trade-off when you try to manage them, and sometimes management may go a little farther than you planned on it going. And, a lot of this, you guys got great answers from Andrew and Mike. There's a lot of different nuances in different water bodies. So I will leave it at that. What I will say is there is so much scrutiny on hydrilla in the Connecticut River. I cannot impress enough upon anybody on this call to make sure whenever you're driving your boat and trailer around, that it be completely free of visible aquatic vegetation. There's a lot of, we're hearing these conversations about access challenges, and those are real. There, as some of you on the call may know, there was a proposal generated by some folks in the town of Chester to restrict access to Cedar Lake, including at the state boat launch. There's always concern about boaters moving things around inadvertently, and that includes hydrilla and other aquatic invasive species. We generally like to tell folks that anglers are among the most educated and knowledgeable folks about, preventing the spread. I believe that. The public doesn't always believe that. So we always need to do our best, and it's no different than telling folks who trout angle on the Farmington River and elsewhere to not leave your bait containers behind or to leave monofilament behind. To the extent that anybody on this, and I realize that not everyone on this call may be a bass angler, but it's really important to, use your best behavior and just go above and beyond. So I know that was a long-winded answer, which is why Mike was probably trying to keep me on mute. That's okay. But I appreciate everybody's participation, and thanks. And if you let me jump in again, I'd be happy to do so. Thank you.
Yeah, well, while we've got you, I think the second part of his question, you're probably going to be able to answer better than myself also. He says, and also, why are people hell-bent on removing the water chestnuts in these backwater areas? The Great Lakes, Hudson River, and Southern Champlain are full of water chestnuts and are some of the most fertile waterways in the country.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The standard answer is that it's another form of an invasive species. And, it's actually one that's much easier to control than hydrilla is. Because if you can do manual removal of these floating leaves, and you can do it before the reproductive seeds, and the seeds isn't the right term, I forget what the term is, before they drop, you can sort of stay on top of it. Different volunteer organizations from, within the Connecticut River and elsewhere, and our agency and others have been doing manual removal for many years. What I can't speak to is if the water chestnuts are native to those other waters that the gentleman had asked about. So yeah, that's a whole nother thing. So that's why there's a concern. And yeah, fertile waters is an interesting term because it's, they're full of nutrients, and, we didn't even go into things like the underlying geology of the Northeast, which is generally much more sterile than many other parts of the country. So we have challenges to growing a lot of big fish. There's no doubt about it. I think one thing that was never mentioned was the fact that, the natural geological fertility of our waters is not the same as you might see in the Midwest or parts of the South. So again, I started to run off the rails. I'm going to impose the gag rule here and turn off my microphone. Thank you.
All right, we're going to go back to Noah Winslow. As far as tournaments, during COVID, there were none, which means no fish were put in live wells, specifically, which means during the spawn as well. Those fish got a break for a whole year, and judging by tournament data and data collected from surveys, it made no difference. So what will be different this time if there was to be a closed time period, a conducted study?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is sort of a natural experiment. And one of the things that we've done is we've done a lot of electrofishing at important bass fisheries, including Candlewood Lake this spring, and we're going again this fall. And that's one of the things that we want to look for, is to see, are we seeing a bunch of fish that would have been spawned in the 2020 season above and beyond what we would typically see. So that taking advantage of that natural experiment is absolutely something that we're looking into. Your question suggests that the data don't support a change. At this point, I don't think that we have crunched the numbers to have a definitive answer. We're in the process of collecting that data and seeing if it's going to impact recruitment. But that is a great point and something we're looking into.
All right, and Chris Byler, has anyone done or are there plans on doing an economic impact study around the proposed changes during the spawning timeframe? This could effectively eliminate all tournaments and have a major impact.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think that we have proposed doing an economic study, but perhaps we should. It's a good suggestion.
I do know that any proposed changes to regulations require an economic impact statement. So
Sure.
that would, if we were to go that route in some way to propose regulations, that would be a requirement to have done. Andrea Navallo, have you guys noticed, and this kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, have you guys noticed any difference in age sizes of fish on Candlewood from the lack of traditional tournament pressure during a time of COVID a couple years ago? I feel like we're seeing more and more smaller fish being caught, whereas before we didn't. I really support catch and immediate release during the bass spawn. We observed many empty bass beds very early on as a result of tournament fishing and out-of-state boats competing, because neighboring states closed bass fishing during that time. Yeah,
so we have not crunched the numbers yet, like I said, but we did do 4 electrofishing samples on Candlewood this spring. We're going to go back again this fall. And it's sort of anecdotal at this point, but comparing the catch from this year so far to previous years, we're seeing the same thing that you're describing, a bunch of younger fish that seem like they could be from the 2020 spawning season, which would support the hypothesis that it does make a difference. But like I'm saying, we haven't crunched those numbers yet. I don't feel comfortable giving a definitive answer. We still need to age those fish. That hasn't been done yet. But just looking at the size distribution, I think there's some early evidence to support what you're seeing.
Okay, Raymond Rondeau, I wanted to add one additional comment. In spite of all the issues, challenges we face, I wanted to indicate that over the last few years, I have run tournaments with the biggest 5 fish weigh-ins in the last 30 years. I recognize we all want to improve bass fishing, but for a state that does not stock bass, fishing is still be pretty good.
Thank you.
And Dan Stevens is following up to Pete with, my point was that since the hydrilla explosion, it's one of the last grasses on the river. The fish actually use them and benefit from, especially in the river where it provides current breaks. And yes, we realize that, that plants are habitat. And again, it's a complicated issue, as Pete alluded to, but hopefully benefits for all. We've reached 8:30, our end of our scheduled allotment. I really appreciate everybody taking time to listen to the presentation, review the plan, and provide comments in the chat. You have Andrew's contact information right on the screen right there. Going forward, we're going to be taking some time to pull this summary together and evaluate and discuss all of the great points that were brought up to us. Again, we really appreciate you taking the time. We understand your passion and we want to support it. Andrew and Pete, or Andrew, would you like to say anything? And then I'll throw it to Pete to wrap it up.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I really appreciate all you guys joining this meeting. I think you have a lot of valuable insights to share, and I really mean that. The feedback that I've gotten from anglers in the last few weeks has been super helpful in thinking how we're going to move forward with this plan, what items we want to prioritize, what things we missed. And so I just want you to know your feedback is heard and appreciated and being taken seriously. And my email is there, andrew.bate@ct.gov. My phone is there, 860-490-0701. shoot me an email anytime, call me, text me, whatever. I'm happy to hear whatever it is you want to talk about. If you didn't get a chance to say it today, or you have a buddy who wasn't able to make it, but you know he or she wants to provide their feedback, feel free to reach out anytime, even after the plan is finalized. Thank you again for your time. Pete, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to try to figure out a way to let folks know even better how to contact you by email and phone, but you've nailed it. So that's the best thing to do. If anybody submitted a couple of last-minute chats or Q&As that we didn't get to, we certainly will. We will respond. But yeah, again, I appreciate everybody's thoughtful comments on this. We realize, you know, not everything is clear cut and simple. There's usually different perspectives and nuances and things to consider. So, you know, as Andrew and Mike pointed out, we've got some evaluating to do and look at what's being done in a few other places. And we're going to just move forward as wisely as we can. And as has been noted several times, we'll be doing this in a transparent manner because we fully believe and honor hearing from anglers. So this has all been great. And again, thank you very much.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.